I'm Robert Harlan, 68, retired investigative journalist, Chappaqua, New York, where the Metro-North gossip is thicker than October fog on the Hudson. The day after Elizabeth's funeral at Street, Mary's Episcopal, my estranged sister Evelyn, showed up at the cider and donuts fair wearing a black coat and a smile sharp enough to slice the church raffle pie. "Heard you're rattling around in that big colonial alone," she said, eyes already measuring the wrap around porch Elizabeth refinished with her own hands. I felt the old reporter's itch something off, but grief is a hell of a blindfold. "Family's family, Robert. Mom would want us to share the house." In the next 70 minutes you'll see forged wills, a near-fatal shove down the cellar stairs, a live podcast takedown in front of the entire PTA, and karma served colder than Sleepy Hollow cider. If you've ever been betrayed by blood, stick with me. I'm about to prove silence is louder than any headline. Let me take you back to the autumn of 2023, when the leaves turned and so did Evelyn. Elizabeth and I built 35 years in that house on Quaker Ridge Road. 3 bedrooms, 2-acre lot backing up to conservation land. Mortgage burned in 2009 with champagne on the back deck. She was a librarian at the Chappaqua Public Library, the kind who remembered every kid's favorite series and stocked tissues during finals week at the high school next door. I spent 3 decades at the Journal News covering Westchester corruption, environmental scandals, the ugly stuff nobody wanted printed but everybody needed to read. Won a Pulitzer nomination in 1998 for exposing a county official's embezzlement scheme that funded his daughter's wedding at the Sleepy Hollow Country Club. That official was married to my sister Evelyn. The fallout was nuclear. Evelyn claimed I destroyed her marriage for a byline, that family loyalty meant more than truth. Her husband went to Sing Sing for 4 years. She moved to Syracuse, changed her phone number, and told our mother I was dead to her. Mom died in 2015 without us ever sharing a room again. I didn't cry at that funeral either. Some bridges burn so hot the ashes are still smoking. Elizabeth never pushed me to reconcile. She understood the weight of choosing truth over blood. That's why I married her in the first place. She saw the world in shades of real and false, not convenient and inconvenient. But cancer doesn't care about your moral clarity. She was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in March 2023. The doctors at Northwell gave her 6 months. She made it 8. Every day a battle she fought with the same quiet fury she used to organize the library's banned book displays. During those final months, Elizabeth did something I didn't discover until after she was gone. She hired a trusts and estates attorney from White Plains, a woman named Diane Rothstein who specialized in asset protection for investigative journalists with enemies. Turns out, Elizabeth had been investing carefully for decades. Library salary, sure, but also family money from her grandfather's textile business in Pennsylvania, stock picks that would make Warren Buffett jealous, and a rental property portfolio in Beacon that tripled in value when the art scene exploded. $35 million, hidden in an irrevocable trust with me as the sole beneficiary, structured so carefully that even the IRS would need a treasure map and a PhD to trace it. She told me about it on a Tuesday in late August, morphine drip clicking beside the hospital bed we'd set up in our living room. The maple tree outside was just starting to hint at gold. "Robert," she said, voice thin as tissue paper, "Evelyn's going to come back. She's going to smell money and opportunity, and she's going to come for this house, for everything we built. Don't tell her about the trust. Don't tell anyone." I promised. Figured it was the cancer talking, the paranoia that comes with pain medication and dying at 63. Elizabeth squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left. "I've been watching the pattern, Robert. She checks your LinkedIn every week. She's been Googling our address. I hired a digital investigator. She's planning something." That was Elizabeth. Librarian on the surface, investigator at heart. She'd spent 35 years married to a journalist and learned every trick. She died on September 12th, 2023, just after midnight. Hospice nurse said it was peaceful. I sat in our bedroom until sunrise, watching the light creep across the conservation land, wondering how you're supposed to breathe when half your lungs are buried. The funeral was small. Library staff, some neighbors, a few old colleagues from my reporting days who still returned my calls. I stood at street. Mary's Episcopal, and delivered a eulogy that barely scratched the surface of who Elizabeth was. The next afternoon I went to the Chappaqua Cider and Harvest Fair because Elizabeth had circled it on the kitchen calendar in red ink. She loved the kettle corn stand and the local pottery vendors. I went because staying in that empty house felt like drowning. That's when Evelyn materialized between the pumpkin display and the face-painting booth. She looked older, 59 now, gray streaking through the dark hair we both inherited from Dad. But that smile was unchanged. The one that used to charm donors at her husband's campaign fundraisers before I printed the truth and turned her world to ash. "Robert," she said, arms open like we'd seen each other last week instead of last decade. "I'm so sorry about Elizabeth. I should have reached out sooner." I stood there holding a cup of cider, watching her eyes flick toward my left hand, checking for a wedding ring, calculating. I decided to play dumb. Classic Harlan patience. The same strategy I used to crack the embezzlement story in 1998. Let them think you're slow. Let them get comfortable. Let them make mistakes. Evelyn asked if she could stay a few days to help sort through Elizabeth's things. I said yes. She moved into the guest room with 2 suitcases and a laptop that never seemed to close. Within a week, she'd joined the Chappaqua PTA. By week 2, she was volunteering at the Church Fall Fair, the same one where she'd ambushed me with condolences. She wore Elizabeth's old library volunteer badge she found in a kitchen drawer, told everyone she was helping her grieving brother through a difficult transition. The neighbors ate it up. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought over a casserole and told me how wonderful it was that family could heal old wounds. I smiled and said Elizabeth would have wanted it this way. I watched Evelyn photograph every room in the house with her phone. She'd stand in doorways, frame shots of the crown molding Elizabeth, and I installed ourselves in 2007, the built-in bookshelves in the den where I kept 30 years of reporting notebooks. She thought she was subtle. I've spent 3 decades watching people lie to my face. You develop a sixth sense for it, like a fisherman reading water. Late at night, I'd hear her on phone calls in the guest room. Walls in these old colonials are thinner than people think, especially when someone's trying to whisper and failing. "It'll fetch at least $1.2 million in this market," she said one Tuesday around 11 p.m., maybe 1.3 with the conservation land backing. "You should see the kitchen sub-zero fridge, that Italian tile Elizabeth insisted on. It's a gold mine." I stood in the hallway in my bathrobe, listening to my sister auction off my life. The next morning she made me French toast. Asked if I'd thought about downsizing, maybe moving to one of those active senior communities in White Plains where I wouldn't have to worry about yard work and property taxes. "You're 68, Robert," she said, pouring maple syrup with a concerned sister expression. "This house is too much for one person. Elizabeth would want you to be practical." I told her I'd think about it. She smiled and squeezed my shoulder like we were in a Hallmark movie. October rolled in with that knife-edge cold that promises winter. The maples on Quaker Ridge Road went full fire, tourists clogging Route 120 for the leaf-peeping bus tours. Evelyn joined one, came back with cider donuts and stories about how charming our little town was. She was building a narrative, the devoted sister caring for her grief-stricken brother, easing him towards sensible decisions about a house he couldn't possibly maintain alone. I let her build it. Elizabeth's voice was in my head every morning. Let greed write its own obituary. One frost-bitten morning in mid-October, Evelyn found Elizabeth's roll-top desk in the study. It was locked, always had been. Elizabeth kept her personal papers there, the stuff she didn't want scattered around the house. "Robert, you still use paper?" Evelyn asked, running her fingers over the brass lock. "How quaint. Very vintage. I bet there's some beautiful stationery in here." She was fishing. I could see it in the way she lingered, waiting for me to offer the key. I told her it was mostly Elizabeth's library planning notes. Nothing interesting. She smiled that campaign fundraiser smile, and let it drop. But that night I heard her trying keys. The guest room was directly above the study. Old houses carry sound like water through pipes. I counted 17 different attempts before she gave up. I almost told her about the trust that night. Came this close. Wanted to see her face when she realized there was $35 million she'd never touch, never see, never spend on whatever Syracuse life she'd rebuilt after her husband's conviction. Then I remembered Elizabeth in that hospital bed, morphine drip clicking, squeezing my hand. Let greed write its own obituary. So I stayed quiet. 3 nights later, I went down to the cellar around 10 p.m. We keep the furnace and water heater down there, and I'd been smelling something off all evening. That sulfur rotten egg smell that means gas. The cellar light flickered when I pulled the chain. I hit the bottom of the stairs, and the smell knocked me back, thick, heavy, pooling in the foundation like invisible water. The gas line to the furnace was loose. Not broken, not corroded. Loose. Like someone had taken a wrench and backed it off just enough to let gas seep, but not enough to trigger an obvious leak. The pilot light on the water heater was still burning. Give it another hour, maybe 2, and the concentration would hit the lower explosive limit. One spark from the furnace trying to kick on, and the whole house would light up like the 4th of July. I shut the main valve with shaking hands, threw open the cellar windows, and stood there in the November cold trying to remember how to breathe. Above me, I heard footsteps. Too light, too fast. The particular rhythm of someone pacing, someone waiting for something to happen. Evelyn's footsteps. I climbed those cellar stairs slower than I've ever climbed anything. Each step deliberate, each step letting the truth settle into my bones the way facts used to settle when I was working a story. My sister wasn't waiting for probate. She wasn't playing a long game. She was accelerating it. And I was supposed to be the headline. Retired journalist dies in tragic gas explosion, survived by loving sister. I didn't sleep that night. Sat in the kitchen with every light blazing, drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid, watching the cellar door like it might sprout teeth. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. Elizabeth spent her final months preparing me for this war. Time to stop playing defense. I climbed to the attic around 7 a.m., to the space Elizabeth had soundproofed with egg cartons and an acoustic foam she ordered from a recording supply company in Brooklyn. She'd built it for me back in 2019 when I was still doing my podcast, Harlan's Ledger. 10 episodes about local corruption, environmental scandals, the stories too small for network news but too important to ignore. I'd stopped recording after Elizabeth got sick. Couldn't focus on exposing other people's lies when my wife was dying. But the equipment was still there. Microphone, mixing board, the laptop Elizabeth bought me with the good processor. I blew dust off the pop filter and hit record. This is Robert Harlan, and welcome back to Harlan's Ledger. It's been 18 months since my last episode. My wife Elizabeth died 5 weeks ago, and I've got a story about inheritance, betrayal, and what happens when blood thinks it's thicker than truth. I'm calling this episode Suburban Inheritance, When Blood Turns to Ink. I kept it vague that first episode. Talked about family estrangement, about sisters who disappear for decades and reappear when they smell money. Discussed the psychology of inheritance disputes. Quoted some estate attorneys about common fraud patterns. Evelyn thought I was grieving publicly, doing that modern therapy thing where you process trauma through creativity. She actually complimented me at breakfast, said it was healthy to channel my pain into something productive. I smiled and thanked her for the support. Episode 2 dropped 3 days later. I named her. Not directly. Used the journalist's trick of describing someone so specifically that anyone who knows them will recognize the portrait. Talked about a family member who'd been cut off after her husband's corruption conviction, who'd spent years plotting a return, who'd recently moved into the subject's home under the guise of sisterly concern. My download numbers went from 200 to 3,000 overnight. Chappaqua loves local drama, especially when it's served with journalistic precision. Evelyn stopped complimenting my therapeutic process. The church coffee hour after Sunday service was packed. November in Westchester, everyone wearing their good wool coats and discussing Thanksgiving plans. I was standing by the urn, pouring terrible coffee into a styrofoam cup, when Evelyn made her move. She walked to the center of the parish hall and pulled a document from her purse. Her voice carried across the room like a hammer on glass. "I need to share something painful," she said. Elizabeth left a will. She wanted me to have the house, to care for Robert in his declining years. It's dated 2 days before she died. The room went silent. Even Father Mike stopped mid-bite on his glazed scone. She held up the paper like Moses with the tablets. I could see Elizabeth's signature from 10 feet away, could see the way the E looped too far right, the way the final flourish went sharp instead of soft. The PTA moms gasped. Mrs. Patterson's hand went to her mouth. Someone dropped a coffee cup and nobody moved to clean it. I walked across the parish hall, took the document from Evelyn's hands, and held it up to the light streaming through the stained glass windows. "Nice calligraphy, Ev," I said. "Really professional work. Too bad Elizabeth's signature loops left, not right, and that's not how she dotted her I's. See, I've got 35 years of anniversary cards, grocery lists, and love notes. I know my wife's handwriting better than I know my own face." Father Mike's scone hit the floor. Evelyn's face went the color of canned pumpkin filling. "You're confused, Robert. Grief does that. Makes you see things that aren't there." "Does grief make you hire document forgers?" I asked. "Because I've got the Venmo receipts. Track them through your phone. You paid someone in Syracuse $400 2 weeks ago." The memo said, "Estate docs rush Job." The parish hall erupted. Evelyn tried to grab the paper back, but I'd already handed it to Father Mike, suggested he might want to call the police about fraud on church property. That Sunday afternoon I recorded episode 3 live. Announced it on the podcast feed 30 minutes before airtime. 18,000 people tuned in, small by network standards, huge for a retired journalist in Westchester County. I played a voicemail Evelyn had left her lawyer. She'd pocket-dialed me 3 days after the gas leak, didn't realize the call had gone through. Her voice crackled through the speakers, clear as confession. "If Robert won't sign the house over, we need to consider other options. An accident on those icy stairs, maybe. He's old, unsteady. People would believe it." The chat exploded. Listener count spiked to 50,000 in real time. Someone started the hashtag Chappaqua Karma. It trended in the New York metro area by dinner. I was still recording when Evelyn stormed into the attic. Face that pumpkin orange rage color, hair wild, eyes promising murder. "You're ruining me," she screamed. "Everything I've worked for, everything I've rebuilt. You're destroying it on some pathetic podcast nobody cares about." I leaned into the microphone, made sure it caught everything. 50,000 people care, Ev. And here's the thing about journalism. Truth doesn't need an audience to be true, but it sure helps when karma wants witnesses. She lunged for the equipment. I kept recording as she pulled cables, knocked over the mic stand, screamed about betrayal and family, and how I'd always chosen strangers over blood. "No," I said quietly. "I chose truth over convenient lies. There's a difference. Elizabeth understood that. Mom would have understood it too, if she'd lived long enough to see you for what you really are." The closing was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the parish hall confrontation. The old brick title company on Quaker Road, the same place Elizabeth and I signed our mortgage refinance papers back in 2009. I arrived 15 minutes early, sat in my truck in the parking lot, watching November wind strip the last leaves from the maples. Thought about Elizabeth and that champagne toast on our deck when we burned the mortgage, how she'd laughed and said we were finally free. Funny how freedom has different definitions depending on who's holding the keys. Evelyn pulled up in a rented Mercedes at exactly 2 p.m. She'd always had a sense for dramatic timing. Wore pearls and a charcoal blazer, the costume of someone who belongs in rooms where money changes hands. She walked past my truck without looking, knew I was there. Could probably feel my eyes on her back. Inside, the title agent was a woman named Patricia, who'd handled half the real estate deals in Chappaqua for the past 20 years. She had reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who'd seen every kind of family drama play out across her conference table. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "Mrs. Keller, please have a seat." Evelyn sat across from me, laid the forged will on the table like she was playing a royal flush. The document looked more official now she'd had it notarized, added some legal letterhead, really committed to the performance. "I think you'll find everything in order," Evelyn said to Patricia. "My brother and I have come to an understanding about Elizabeth's wishes." Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses. "Mr. Harlan, have you reviewed these documents with your attorney?" "I have," I said. Which was true. Diane Rothstein, Elizabeth's trust attorney, had spent an hour explaining exactly how many laws Evelyn had broken. We'd counted 8 felonies and a misdemeanor. The misdemeanor was my favorite, filing a false instrument. Such a polite way to say lying on paper. Evelyn slid a pen across the table toward me. Mont Blanc, expensive. Probably thought the weight of it would make this feel more legitimate. Sign, Robert, she said. Voice sweet as antifreeze. Unless you want that gas leak story to go to the Journal News. I've got friends there. They'd love to hear how the great Robert Harlan is losing his grip, imagining sabotage, making wild accusations against his devoted sister. I looked at that pen, looked at Evelyn, felt something shift in the air like the moment before thunder when the pressure drops and your ears pop. Elizabeth's hand on my shoulder. Phantom weight but steady. The way she used to touch me when I was working a difficult story and needed to remember why truth mattered. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket, opened the podcast app, hit the button for live streaming. Ladies and gentlemen, I said to the phone, to the 8,000 people who'd tuned in within 30 seconds, welcome to a special episode of Harlan's Ledger. We're at Heritage Title Company on Quaker Road, and you're about to witness something remarkable. Evelyn's face went from confident to confused to terrified in about 2 seconds. Patricia just leaned back in her chair like she'd been expecting this. Meet my sister Evelyn, I continued. She's about to coerce me into signing over my house using a forged will and threats based on an attempted murder she committed 3 weeks ago. The gas leak, Ev. Remember, when you loosened the furnace line and waited for me to become a headline? Evelyn stood up fast enough to knock her chair backward. You're insane. Patricia, he's clearly not competent to... The door opened. 2 Westchester County Sheriff's deputies walked in like they'd been waiting for their cue, which they had been. Diane Rothstein had coordinated the whole thing with the district attorney's office after I'd provided the voicemail evidence, the Venmo receipts, and a sworn statement about the gas line. Evelyn Keller, the first deputy said. Evelyn looked at me, at the deputies, at Patricia, who was quietly gathering up the forged documents like evidence, which they were. You have the right to remain silent, the deputy continued. The handcuffs clicked with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Evelyn sobbed. Actual tears, running mascara, the whole performance. I just wanted what was mine. After everything you did to me, Robert, you destroyed my marriage, my life. I just wanted what I deserved. I stood up, walked around the table until I was close enough to see my reflection in her ruined makeup. You wanted what was never yours, I said quietly. Elizabeth built that life with me. Brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. 35 years of choosing each other every single day. You showed up at a funeral and thought you could claim it like lost luggage. The deputies led her toward the door. She was still crying, still making noise, still performing for an audience that had stopped caring. Patricia took off her reading glasses and rubbed her eyes. Worst closing since the financial crisis in 2008. And I had one where the husband tried to sell his wife's half without telling her. I almost laughed. Would have if my chest didn't feel like it was full of broken glass. Outside, the bell at St. Mary's Episcopal began to ring. Noon. The sound rolled across Quaker Road, across the conservation land, across the town Elizabeth and I had called home for 35 years. Maple leaves fell like confetti, like applause, like Chappaqua itself was taking a bow. I stood in the parking lot and watched my sister disappear into the back of a sheriff's vehicle, watched the title company door close, watched the ordinary Tuesday afternoon continue like the world hadn't just served karma colder than the November wind. Elizabeth would have appreciated the poetry of it. 6 months later. Apple picking season on Quaker Ridge Road. The maples are doing their thing again, turning the conservation land behind my house into something that looks like God spilled his paint set. The tourists are back with their cameras and their children, pointing at leaves like they've never seen autumn before. I get it now. Every season is new when you're paying attention. The colonial on Quaker Ridge Road isn't mine anymore, not in the way it was. I donated it along with $30 million from Elizabeth's trust to establish the Elizabeth Harlan Journalism Legacy Center. Diane Rothstein helped me structure it as a 501c3. Took 4 months of paperwork and lawyer fees that would make your eyes water, but we got it done. The same rooms where Evelyn plotted her inheritance heist are now classrooms where high school students from Chappaqua and the surrounding districts learn investigative journalism, media ethics, and how to fact-check in a world that's allergic to truth. The wraparound porch Elizabeth refinished with her own hands is where kids sit on Friday afternoons, editing their first articles on laptops, arguing about sources and story angles the way Elizabeth and I used to argue about everything from politics to the best pizza in Westchester. I kept $5 million from the trust, paid off some old debts, set up a retirement account that won't run dry, donated another chunk to the Chappaqua Public Library in Elizabeth's name. They're building a new wing for investigative journalism resources, breaking ground next spring. The rest went to the center. Elizabeth would have done the same thing. She believed in passing it forward, in building something that outlasts your own breathing. I mentor 3 days a week. Teach the kids how to find the story beneath the story, how to ask the questions people don't want to answer, how to choose truth over comfort even when it costs you everything. They listen like I'm handing them keys to locked rooms. Maybe I am. The podcast kept going. Harlan's Ledger is up to 43 episodes now, averaging 100,000 downloads per week. Not Joe Rogan numbers, but enough to matter. I cover local corruption, environmental issues, the small stories that shape communities. Episode 27 was about Clara. Clara Mendez, local historian, ran the Chappaqua Historical Society from a Victorian house on King Street. She'd been fact-checking my podcast episodes in real time, sending detailed emails pointing out when I got a date wrong or misidentified a building. Most people would find that annoying. I found it attractive. We met for coffee at Longa's Delicatessen in October. She ordered pastrami on rye and told me my episode about the Metro North Station renovation had missed a crucial detail about the original 1847 foundation. I asked her to marry me in January, standing on the train platform in question, snow falling like punctuation marks. She said yes before I finished the question. We got married at St. Mary's Episcopal in March. Small ceremony. Father Mike officiating. The same church where Evelyn had tried to destroy me with her forged will. Felt right to reclaim that space with something true. Clara moved into the guest house I built behind the Colonial Well, behind the center now. We take morning walks on the Hudson trails, drink coffee on her porch that overlooks the conservation land, argue about historical accuracy and whether the Oxford comma matters. Turns out love at 68 feels different than love at 33. Quieter, deeper. Less about passion and more about choosing someone every single morning because they make truth feel like home. Evelyn's doing 5 years at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. Pled guilty to forgery, attempted murder, and 3 counts of fraud. Her lawyer tried for a suspended sentence. Claimed grief had driven her to temporary insanity. The judge wasn't buying. Said anyone who could plan attempted murder with that level of detail wasn't insane, just evil. Her cell doesn't overlook any cider festivals, no wraparound porches, no Metro North trains carrying leaf peepers up from the city. Just concrete and razor wire and time to think about what happens when greed becomes your religion. I don't visit. Clara asked if I wanted to, if it might bring closure. I told her I closed that door when the handcuffs clicked. Some bridges stay burned. Every autumn when the church fair comes around, I walk through the same booths where Evelyn ambushed me with condolences and calculations. The kettle corn still smells the same. The cider is still too sweet. The pottery vendors still sell the same mugs Elizabeth used to collect. But now I can breathe there. Last week I stood by the donut stand, watching kids from the Journalism Center interview vendors for their community journalism project. Watch them ask good questions, take careful notes, double-check their facts before moving to the next booth. The wind came off the Hudson carrying that October cold that promises winter, and I felt Elizabeth in it, not phantom weight on my shoulder this time, just presence, just knowing. Truth wins, Robert, and so do we. I bought a cup of hot cider, walked back to the center where Clara was teaching a workshop on archival research, set up my microphone in the attic studio still soundproofed with egg cartons and Elizabeth's love. Hit record. This is Robert Harlan, and you're listening to Harlan's Ledger. Today's episode is about second acts, about what happens after betrayal, after loss, after you choose truth and watch it burn down everything you thought you knew. I raised the cider cup toward the mic, toward the 8,000 listeners tuning in, toward the life Elizabeth and I built and the one I'm building now. To second acts, I said, to suburban karma, and to the stories that outlive us all. Outside, the church bell rang. Maple leaves fell. And somewhere in the conservation land behind the center, the wind carried Elizabeth's laugh across 35 years and 6 months and infinity. Truth won. And so did we.